The gala was everything they promised. Gold leaf invitations, a venue that smelled of fresh lilies and expensive perfume, and enough socialites to populate a small country. I stood by the champagne tower, the fabric of my dress feeling like armor rather than silk, when I heard it. A voice, sharp and rehearsed, cutting through the low hum of polite conversation. "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made," she said. I didn't turn around immediately. I didn't have to. I knew the cadence of that voice, the slight rasp, the deliberate condescension. It was Alina, my former mother-in-law. She was standing barely 3 feet away, draped in emerald velvet, looking at me as if I were a smudge of dirt on her pristine evening. Beside her, Mark, my ex-husband, looked anywhere but at me. 5 minutes, I said, my voice steady, barely a whisper. "Give me 5 minutes, Alina, and you'll realize that the decision to leave wasn't his to make." The color drained from her face, leaving her looking suddenly fragile. Mark's eyes finally snapped to mine, filled with a sudden, dawning panic. He knew exactly what I was carrying in my clutch, a document that would turn this entire charity gala into the most expensive bonfire of his reputation. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the truth has a way of finding its mark, and dignity is the ultimate weapon. If you've ever been discarded by people who thought you were disposable, if you've ever had to quietly hold the receipts while the world whispered that you were the villain, this story is for you. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and join us, because tonight the bill for a lifetime of deception is finally coming due. But to understand how I ended up here, in a room full of people who once toasted to my tragic downfall, we have to go back to the beginning, back to when I was the one keeping the lights on. My name is Sarah. I'm 34, and for the better part of a decade, I wasn't just a wife, I was a stabilizer. I worked as a senior auditor for a private equity firm. My life was defined by spreadsheets, risk assessments, and the relentless pursuit of precision. I thought that if I was organized enough, if I was loyal enough, if I was simply good enough, I could audit the flaws out of my own marriage. I was wrong. When I met Mark, he was between ventures, a charming, ambitious dreamer who needed a steady hand. I provided that hand. For 8 years, I funded the startup costs, covered the mortgage during the lean months, and navigated the emotional minefield of his mother, Elena, who viewed me as a glorified bank account with a heartbeat. I remember the day I realized the audit of my own life was coming up negative. It was a Tuesday. I had come home early, hoping to surprise Mark with an anniversary dinner. Instead, I found a pile of legal filings on our dining table, documents for a new business, a company I had never heard of in a state where we didn't live, naming an executive team that didn't include me, but definitely included Elena's hand-picked business partner. I was being written out of my own life. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He didn't even try to lie. He just looked at me with that chilling, detached calm and said, "Sarah, you're a creature of habit. You don't take risks. This business, it requires a certain ruthlessness you just don't have. Mother agrees." They had been planning this for months. My salary, my savings, my credit, it had all been siphoned into a project designed to move forward without me. They didn't just want a divorce, they wanted to strip mine my future to fund theirs. The day I walked out, I didn't take much. I left the house, the car, and the furniture. I took my computer, my professional files, and most importantly, the digital footprint of every cent I had ever contributed to Mark's dreams. I spent the next year in absolute silence. No social media, no mutual friends, no getting even. I went to ground. I focused on my firm. I rose from senior auditor to partner in record time. I became the person who spots the anomaly in the ledger that everyone else misses. And then, 3 weeks ago, the invitation arrived in the mail, a thick cream-colored envelope for this gala. It was addressed to me, sent by the charity Elena chaired. Inside was a note, handwritten in her unmistakable, jagged script. "We are celebrating the success of Mark's venture. We thought you might like to see what real success looks like. Hope you've learned to manage on your own." It wasn't an invitation, it was a taunt, a final victory lap. They thought I was still the woman who would cry in the driveway. They thought I was still the woman who couldn't balance her own accounts without looking to them for approval. They had no idea that I had spent the last year auditing their new venture, tracking the offshore accounts they used to hide the funds they stole from me, and identifying the exact moment their house of cards would collapse under the weight of an SEC investigation. I watched the clock on my office wall. My pulse didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I was ready. I'm standing here now, in this ballroom, and I can see the fear in Mark's eyes. He thinks I'm here to cause a scene. He thinks I'm going to scream, to make a mess, to act like the unstable woman they painted me as in the divorce papers. They have no idea. The waiter is passing by with a fresh tray of champagne. Mark is gripping his flute so hard his knuckles are white. Elena is still standing there, her mouth slightly open, waiting for me to lose my composure. I take a slow breath. 5 minutes. Elena stood her ground, though I noticed the way her fingers trembled against the velvet of her clutch. "I don't know what kind of pathetic game you're playing, Sarah," she hissed, her voice low enough that the nearby socialites didn't hear. "But you aren't welcome here. This is an evening for legitimate business, for success, not for whatever this is." I didn't answer right away. I simply looked past her, toward the main stage where the spotlight was already warming up. A display screen showed the logo of Mark's new company, a sleek, modern design that had been paid for with the inheritance money I had foolishly liquidated for his first failed venture. "Legitimate business," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Is that what we're calling it, Elena? I've spent the last 12 months conducting a very thorough audit of your legitimate success. I have to say, the margins are creative." Mark stepped forward, his face flushed. "Sarah, stop it. You're making a fool of yourself. Nobody here cares about your petty grievances. We've moved on. You should try it." He looked so confident in his tuxedo, so entirely convinced that he had successfully buried the past. He didn't see the way I was watching him, not with anger, but with the cold, detached precision of a forensic accountant looking at a fraudulent ledger. "I have moved on, Mark," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a bell. "In fact, I've moved on to places you can't even afford to visit anymore." I looked at my watch. 3 minutes had passed. "You invited me here to see what real success looks like," I continued, finally locking eyes with him. "But you forgot one thing about auditors, Mark. We don't just look at what's on the surface. We look at the source. We look at the liabilities you try to hide in the footnotes." Elena let out a sharp, brittle laugh. "Liabilities? You're the only liability that ever touched this family. Mark, tell security to remove her. I won't have her ruining my moment." Mark turned to flag down a member of the event staff, but he stopped. His eyes drifted to the entrance of the ballroom. I didn't need to turn around to know what he saw. 2 men in charcoal gray suits were walking through the doors. They weren't security. They were moving with a singular, terrifying focus, scanning the room not for trouble, but for a specific person. The room grew perceptibly quieter as they neared the stage. The music, a soft jazz ensemble, seemed to stumble. "Who are they?" Elena asked, her voice losing its edge, replaced by a sudden, thin layer of uncertainty. "They're the people who don't care about your gala, Elena," I replied, smoothing the fabric of my dress. "They care about the offshore accounts linked to the Cayman shell company you used to funnel the initial investment, the one that was supposed to go into a sustainable tech firm, but ended up in a high-frequency trading algorithm that crashed in October." Mark's face had gone the color of parchment. "Sarah, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Mark. The numbers did it for me." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single, plain manila envelope. I didn't hand it to him. I simply held it, the weight of it suddenly feeling immense. The men in the charcoal suits were now only 10 feet away. One of them reached into his inner pocket and produced a badge, his eyes locking onto Mark with an efficiency that was purely, beautifully clinical. The ballroom was silent now. The socialites, the donors, the business partners, everyone had stopped. The spotlight on the stage flickered, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished floor. "Mark Peterson?" the man in the lead asked. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silence of the room, it felt like a gavel striking a desk. "Yes?" Mark's voice was a barely audible squeak. "I'm Special Agent Miller. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding federal wire fraud and the misappropriation of investor funds." Elena gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, and collapsed back into the nearest chair. Mark looked at me, his mouth opening and closing, his arrogance evaporating in real time. I didn't feel triumph. I felt an odd, hollow sort of relief. The audit was complete. The books were balanced. I leaned in, just close enough for him to hear over the sudden commotion of the room. "You were right, Elena," I whispered. "Leaving me was the best decision he ever made, because if he were still with me, I would have caught this before the feds did, and I would have made sure he stayed out of prison." I turned, my heels clicking perfectly against the marble, and began to walk toward the exit. The room was no longer a ballroom. It was a theater of cascading reputations. As the agents escorted Mark toward the side exit, the murmurs began, a low, rhythmic buzz that traveled from table to table like static electricity. I didn't rush. I walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who had nowhere else to be. "Sarah, wait!" Elena's voice was no longer sharp. It was thin, desperate, and cracking at the edges. She stumbled as she stood up, her velvet train catching on the leg of her chair, but she didn't care. She was moving toward me, her eyes frantic, searching for the mask she usually wore but couldn't find. I stopped. I didn't turn around instantly. I gave her the grace of 1 second before I faced her. The change in her was startling. She looked like a woman who had just realized her castle was made of nothing more than cardboard and ego. "You did this," she said, though it wasn't an accusation, it was a plea. "You've been planning this for a year. You could have stopped him. You could have said something." I looked at her, my expression perfectly neutral. This was the moment I had played out in my head 1,000 times while sitting in my sterile office reviewing the very transactions that were now being used as evidence. "Elena," I said, my voice quiet enough that she had to lean in to hear me. "If you see a thief walking into a bank with a bag, is it your job to warn him that he's being filmed, or is it your job to let the law do its work?" "We are family," she choked out, a phrase she had weaponized against me for nearly a decade. "No," I corrected her, not with bitterness, but with the cold weight of a final audit. "We were a business arrangement that you decided to dissolve. You chose the terms. You chose to move forward without me. Don't be surprised now that the accounts have been settled." Behind her, I saw a woman I recognized, a major donor to the charity, someone who had looked down on me at every fundraiser for years. She was watching Elena, her expression a mix of pity and calculated distance. The social contract of this room was disintegrating. People were already distancing themselves from the Peterson name, moving their chairs, checking their phones, and finalizing the narrative that they had never really trusted Mark to begin with. "What do I do?" Elena asked, the question so small it barely registered. "His accounts, they're frozen. My legal fees." "I wouldn't know," I said, turning back toward the door. "I'm not the family auditor anymore." As I walked, I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. It was one of the agents, Agent Miller. He stopped me just outside the alcove. "Ms. Peterson," he said, using my maiden name, a small courtesy I appreciated. "We'll need a formal statement regarding the documentation you provided. Do you have the contact information for my office?" "I do, and everything is organized by date, entity, and transaction ID. You won't find a single discrepancy." "We've already verified the first batch," he said, and for a fleeting second, his professional veneer cracked into something resembling respect. That was meticulous work. "It was just data," I said. "Data doesn't lie. Only people do." I stepped out into the cool night air of the parking lot. The humidity was gone, replaced by a crisp breeze that felt like a reset button. I reached into my bag. pulled out my car keys, and paused. My phone buzzed. It was an email from the firm, a message from the managing partner, already aware of the news, likely alerted by the market chatter. "Effective work, Sarah. See you in the morning." I leaned against my car, taking a long, slow breath. I remembered the nights I had spent crying in this very spot when I was married to Mark, wondering why I couldn't make him happy, why I couldn't be enough. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had poured into his failures, the times I had apologized for his mistakes, and the exhaustion of trying to be the foundation for a house that was built on sand. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had come here to see what real success looked like, and as I looked at the dark windows of the Gala, I realized I had seen it. Success wasn't the Gala, or the emerald velvet, or the staged success of a fraudulent startup. Success was knowing exactly who you are, what you're worth, and having the courage to let the wrong people walk out of your life. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Brooke, Mark's sister, the one person who had stayed out of the business dealings, mostly because she was too busy living her own chaotic life. I saw the news. I'm not saying I'm surprised. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, and thank you for getting me out of that deal before it hit the fan. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The balance was shifting, and for the first time, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of it. The drive home was quiet. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of my past life, but the clean, intentional silence of a new beginning. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need the distraction. For the first time in years, my thoughts were my own, and they were finally free from the frantic task of damage control. When I reached my apartment, a space I had curated exactly to my liking with no one else's clutter or ego to manage, I didn't pour a drink. I simply walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. The ledger I had been keeping for the last 12 months was still open, the final entries now officially reconciled. My phone vibrated on the desk, a missed call from my mother and 3 text messages from Elena, all of which I deleted without reading. The family bridge wasn't just burned, it had been dismantled, brick by brick, by the very people who had once insisted it was the only road I should ever travel. I thought back to that moment at the Gala, the look on Elena's face when she realized her son's best decision had led him directly into a federal investigation. People often ask me if I feel guilty. They ask if, deep down, I wanted to save them, and for a long time, I did. I spent years thinking that being a fixer was an act of love. I thought that by smoothing over the rough edges of their lives, I was keeping us together. But standing in my living room, the city lights shimmering outside my window, I realized the truth. I hadn't been keeping them together. I had been subsidizing their dysfunction. By constantly picking up the pieces, I had robbed them of the one thing that might have changed them, the consequence of their own choices. The next morning, the fallout was everywhere. The financial news sites were already running the story of the firm's collapse, and the legal blogs were picking apart the details of the wire fraud charges. I saw a headline that made me pause. The Peterson Gala, a charity event, turns into a crime scene. I didn't dwell on it. I closed the tab and logged into my firm's portal. That afternoon, I had a meeting with the managing partner. He didn't ask me about the emotional side of the arrest. He didn't ask about Mark or Elena. He simply placed a file on the table, a promotion packet. "The board was impressed by your handling of the Peterson investigation," he said, his tone clinical. "You showed the kind of discretion and forensic rigor we need in a senior partner. You've earned this, Sarah." I looked at the folder, then back at him. "Thank you," I said. "I'm looking forward to the new challenges." It was that simple. No drama, no performance, no need to be the strong girl for anyone's benefit but my own. I had built a career on the ability to see the truth in the numbers, and I had finally applied that same skill to my own life. I walked out of that office and headed straight to the coffee shop near my firm. It was the same one I used to frequent during the darkest days of the divorce. I ordered my usual, a black coffee, and sat by the window. A few tables away, a young woman was sitting with her laptop, looking stressed, her brow furrowed as she stared at a screen full of numbers. She was biting her lip, her hand shaking slightly as she typed. It was the version of me from 3 years ago, the one who thought her worth was tied to how many fires she could put out for people who didn't care if she burned. I stood up, walked over, and set my business card on her table. "You look like you're carrying a lot of weight," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "If you ever need someone to show you how to look at the ledger differently, not as a burden but as a map to your own freedom, call me." She looked up at me startled, and then, for a brief second, she saw something in my expression that made her shoulders drop an inch. She didn't say anything, but she took the card. I walked out of the shop and into the sunlight. The story ends here, but the life begins now. I didn't get an apology from Elena. I didn't get a heartfelt confession from Mark. And the truth is, I don't need them. The best revenge isn't a scene in a ballroom or a dramatic final word. The best revenge is living a life so full, so stable, and so completely yours that you don't even remember to check if they're watching. I'm Sarah, and I'm finally off the clock. If you've ever felt like your role in your family was just to be the bank, the fixer, or the quiet one, if you're tired of the performance, remember this: you don't owe anyone the price of your own peace. Boundaries aren't mean, they're the fence that keeps your life yours. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you even a small sense of the justice you deserve, drop a comment below and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Truth Stories for more journeys back to ourselves. We'll see you in the next one.